It's true that a Democrat President, Lyndon Johnson, shepherded the 1964 Civil Rights Act to passage. But who voted for it? 87% of Republicans voted yes to only 61% of Democrats who voted yes. In the Senate, 82% of Republicans favored the law, only 69% of Democrats. And among the Democrats who voted against it, Al Gore Sr., Robert Byrd, and William Fulbright. Robert Byrd would become majority leader of the Democrat Party. William Fulbright, Bill Clinton's primary mentor. The Republican presidential candidate in 1964 also opposed the Civil Rights Act. Barry Goldwater had been an enthusiastic backer of the 1957 and the 1960 Civil Rights Acts, both overwhelmingly opposed by Democrats. He was a founding member of the Arizona chapter of the NAACP. He hired many blacks in his family business and pushed to desegregate the Arizona National Guard. And he had a good faith objection to some features of the 1964 Act, writes Charon, which he regarded as unconstitutional. Goldwater was no racist. The same cannot be said of Fulbright, on whom Clinton bestowed the Medal of Freedom. Fulbright was one of 19 senators who signed the Southern Manifesto defending segregation. I've written about this at length myself, but I just want to repeat it. Okay, but didn't all the old segregationist senators leave the Democratic Party and become Republicans after 1964? No, just one, Strom Thurmond. The rest remained in the Democratic Party, including former Klansman Robert Byrd, who became president pro tem of the Senate. Former racists of both parties renounced their old views. Kevin Williamson of National Review points out Johnson himself voted against anti-lynching laws and poll tax repeals as a senator. And neither party has a perfect record on racial matters by any stretch. But it is a libel to suggest that the Republican Party, the anti-slavery party, the party of Lincoln, and the party that traditionally supported civil rights, anti-lynching laws, and integration became the racist party after 1964. The so-called Solid South Democratic voting pattern began to break not in the 1960s in response to civil rights, but in the 1950s in response to economic development in the Cold War. Black voters in the North, who'd been reliable Republicans, began to abandon the GOP in response to the New Deal, encouraged by certain activists to, quote, turn Lincoln's picture to the wall. That debt had been paid, said Robert Vann. In the 1940s, the GOP garnered about only 25% of Southern votes. The big break came with Dwight Eisenhower's victories. Significant percentages of white Southerners voted for Ike, though the Democratic Party remained firmly segregationist, and though Eisenhower backed 2 civil rights bills and enforced the Brown decision by federalizing the National Guard. They also began to send Republican representatives to the House. So these Republican gains came not from the most rural and deep South regions, but from the newer cities and suburbs. If the new Southern Republican voters were white racists, one would have expected that Mississippi and Alabama and Georgia would have been the first to turn. Instead, as General Alexander notes in The Myth of the Racist Republicans, the turn toward the GOP began in Virginia, North Carolina, Texas, Tennessee, and Florida. Eisenhower did best in the peripheral states. And Alexander concludes, the GOP Southern electorate was not rural, nativist, less-educated, afraid of change, or concentrated in the Deep South. It was disproportionately suburban, middle-class, educated, young, non-native Southern, and concentrated in the growth points that were the least Southern parts of the South. The point is, folks, Rangel is peddling a libel, and Republicans should say so loudly and often. No, the Republicans didn't change places with the Democrats. Yes, the Democrats have rewritten history and have hijacked the so-called civil rights movement, which now attacks with a broad brush law enforcement, opposes the voting franchise by refusing to support efforts to ensure that only those who can vote will vote, and promotes massive, big federal government, socialism and redistribution of wealth, and all those things that are anti-liberty. Because that's what they are.